Montana Territory, late autumn of 1882. The wind howled like a starving thing across the Bitterroot Valley, and Lark O'Hara held her newborn son against her chest, as if sheer will could keep him warm. The doctor had already packed his bag. "He will not live through the night," he'd said, not unkindly but with the flat tone of a man who had seen too many small graves. "The birth drained him. He is too weak to nurse. I am sorry." Lark had not wept, not then. She had nodded and thanked him. And now, with dusk pressing against the windows of the small cabin her late husband had built with his own hands, she sat in the rocker, her baby swaddled in blankets that could not stop the shivering in his tiny body. His name was Jameson. He had not cried since he was born. Just a faint mewling sound, now gone. His skin was pale, lips barely pink. And still she would not let go. A knock came at the door. Lark did not answer it. She thought it might be the midwife, coming back with more willow bark or maybe just to sit beside her. But when the door creaked open, it was not the midwife. It was the cowboy from across the ridge. The one who had helped her mend the fence last spring when the storms knocked it flat. The one who had not spoken more than a dozen words to her, but always tipped his hat and kept his eyes kind. Gideon Prescott. He stepped inside, tall and quiet, his coat dusted with snow, his hat in his hands. "I saw the doctor ride out fast. Figured something was wrong." Her voice barely came. "Jameson, they said he will not make it through the night." Gideon did not speak for a moment. His gaze moved to the bundle in her arms, then to the fire. He crossed the room and added 2 more logs. Then he looked at her again. "Let me hold him." Lark blinked. "What? Give him to me. I have known cold nights. You look near frozen yourself." "Let me hold him close, keep him warm." She hesitated, her arms tightening. "He is mine, I know." His voice was soft. "But I have strong arms and a warm chest. Let me help." She looked at Jameson. His breathing was so shallow now she could barely feel it. Her arms trembled. Her own body ached from the birth. At last, she stood and slowly, carefully, placed the tiny bundle into Gideon's arms. He moved to the hearth, sat down against the stone and wrapped the boy tight against him, his coat pulled close around both of them. He cradled Jameson to his chest, skin to skin, rough hands gentle. Lark watched silent. The hours crawled. The wind moaned. Snow began to fall outside. Gideon never once slept. He sang sometimes, low and quiet, songs Lark did not know, but they sounded like comfort. He whispered to Jameson, words she could not quite hear. And once, when she turned her head to press her sleeve to her eyes, she saw him kiss the boy's forehead. In the gray light before dawn, Jameson stirred. His little mouth opened. A soft, sharp cry filled the room. Lark gasped and rushed to him. "He cried," she whispered. "He cried." Gideon smiled, weary and full of something deep. "He is warm." She took Jameson back into her arms, and for the first time he latched to feed. Her hands shook as she held him close, tears sliding down her cheeks. Gideon stood slowly, his knees stiff. "He is a fighter, so are you." She looked up at him. "You saved him." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You did. I just held on through the night." Lark stepped closer. "You stayed," he nodded. "I would again." Their eyes met. For the first time she saw something steady and sure in his gaze, not just kindness. Something more. Jameson suckled, strong now, his tiny fist curled against her breast. Lark looked down at her son, then back up at Gideon. "Would you stay a little longer?" Gideon did not hesitate. "As long as you will have me." And just like that, the long, dark night broke. The sun rose over the mountains, golden across the snow, and the cabin filled with light. The morning passed slowly, light growing across the floorboards like spilled milk. Lark moved with measured care, the ache of childbirth still heavy in her limbs. Jameson slept against her chest, breath even now. his body warm where it pressed into hers. She hadn't dared to hope for this life, after all that stillness. Gideon sat near the stove, mending a tear in his shirt with practiced hands. The fire crackled but didn't roar. Even the sounds in the cabin had softened, like the world was holding its breath. "You do your own sewing?" Lark asked, not looking up from the basin where she rinsed a cloth. "Never had much choice." He glanced at her, threading the needle again. "My sister taught me, back before the war. You have a sister, had. She died in Kansas. Fever took her and my ma the same winter." Lark looked over then, the cloth forgotten in her hands. "I'm sorry, Gideon." He nodded once, the gesture small. "You don't have to be. It was a long time ago. I was 16. That kind of grief sets deep, but it settles, like silt in a river." Lark sat down carefully, Jameson still sleeping in her arms. "I've never heard it put that way. I've had time to think on it. Most nights there's not much else to do." She let the quiet linger. The only sound was the steady sucking of the stove and Jameson's soft breaths. "You have people still?" she asked. "Some cousins scattered." "One runs cattle up near Helena. I see him every few years when the trails cross right, but I never stayed long anywhere, not since I came west." Lark traced a finger along Jameson's bundled back. "What made you come here?" Gideon didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice came lower. "I was looking for somewhere quieter, somewhere that didn't know my name." She tilted her head. "You in trouble?" "No, nothing like that. Just tired of being looked at like I was something broken." He set the mended shirt aside and met her eyes. "That's not the kind of thing you can explain to strangers. They either see it or they don't." Lark nodded slowly. "I know what that feels like." "I reckon you do." Outside, a crow called from the bare branches of the cottonwood. Frost still clung to the grass, but the sun had begun to cut through it. Jameson stirred. Lark adjusted him gently, pulling the shawl higher around his head. "He has your eyes," Gideon said softly. Lark blinked. "He's not yours." "I know. I just meant he has a strong gaze." "Like you." She didn't answer at first. Then, "He'll need strong eyes. This place doesn't show mercy." Gideon stood and opened the door partway. His breath fogged as he looked out over the snow-swept field. "Maybe not. But it shows beauty if you know where to look." Lark watched the light outline his figure, the cut of his shoulders beneath the flannel, the way he stepped aside so she could see the line of the valley beyond. "What are you planning to do next?" she asked. He let the door close behind him. "Depends." "On what?" "Whether I'm needed." She looked down at her son, then back at the man who had held him through the longest night of her life, the man who hadn't asked for anything in return. "I don't have much," she said. "I'm not here for much, just here." Her voice was quiet. "I could use help with the roof before the snows come proper. I can do that. And the barn's got a sag in the back wall. Might not hold if the wind comes hard. I'll see to it." She looked at him fully then, the lines around her eyes softened by the morning light. "And I could use company sometimes, when the evenings stretch too long." Gideon stepped closer, his hands loose at his sides. "That's something I can offer." Lark didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. "Then stay." "I'll stay." His voice held no doubt. Jameson shifted again, and Lark tucked the blanket around him. The child's face was still pale but calm, his breathing sure. The wind outside had dulled to a hum, and the cabin, for the first time in many months, felt full. Gideon picked up the axe by the hearth. "I'll fetch more wood." "You'll need it tonight." Lark watched him go, the door closing behind him with a soft clunk. She looked down at Jameson, then around at the cabin that had once felt too big for one person. Now it didn't feel big at all. It felt just right. The third morning came with a hush of frost over the pasture grass, and a stillness in the air that often meant snow by nightfall. Lark stepped outside with Jameson bundled close and stood just beneath the eaves, letting the cold bite her cheeks. A hawk circled far above, its wings catching the light like burnished copper. Beneath it, the world held its breath. Gideon was in the barn, hammering a new brace into place where the back wall leaned too hard into the wind. The sound carried in steady rhythm: wood, nail, wood, nail. She hadn't asked him to get to it so soon, but he'd started before the sun rose, shrugging off the chill with a kind of quiet determination. She watched him through the open barn door, the way his movements were deliberate, like each task gave purpose to his hands. The horse, a gentle old sorrel that had come with the property, stood tethered in the corner, watching him with the same calm stillness. "Would you take a ride with me?" Lark asked once he stepped out into the yard, wiping his hands on a rag. Gideon glanced at the sling wrapped across her shoulder. "With the baby. I've a basket that hooks to the saddle horn. My husband made it last spring so I could gather herbs and still keep Jameson near. He fits just fine." He nodded once, then looked toward the tree line where the ridge broke and a narrow trail curved through the birch and larch. "Where to?" "Just up to the hollow. There's something I want to show you." They rode single file, Lark on the mare and Gideon on his taller bay gelding. The morning light dappled through the thinning canopy. Jameson slept in the padded basket, his breath fogging the wool tucked around him. The trail wound through a stand of tamaracks already gone golden, their needles soft underfoot. When they reached the hollow, Lark dismounted and tethered the mare to a low-hanging branch. Gideon followed without question, trailing her on foot to a small rise overlooking the stream below. A cluster of smooth stones marked two graves, one larger, the other no longer than a cradle. "My daughter," Lark said quietly, "Clara. She was born the year before last, lived 10 weeks. Gideon didn't speak. He stepped beside her, hands in his coat pockets, eyes on the stream. "I buried her myself. Dug the earth with a trowel because I couldn't bear to ask for help." Her voice didn't shake, but the words came slow. "My husband was alive then. He planted wild rose over her that summer. It never took." "Some things don't need flowers to be remembered," Gideon said. Lark knelt and brushed away the frost from the smaller stone, her fingers bare despite the cold. "I thought I should tell you. You sat with Jameson all night and I never said. You don't owe me explanation." "No, but I owe her honesty." She rose and turned to him. "I was afraid that night. Not just of losing Jameson, but of feeling it all again. I didn't think I could bear it, and then there you were." He met her eyes. "You didn't break." "No," she said, "but I fractured." Gideon looked out across the stream, the water moving slow and clear over stones. "Grief leaves marks. But it don't mean you're ruined." Lark watched him, the warmth of something old and quiet rising behind her ribs. "What did the war leave with you?" His mouth tightened and he took a long breath. "Noise, mostly in my head. I sleep light, still wake sometimes reaching for a rifle." She nodded. "I boil poppy with milk when sleep won't come, just a little. It doesn't numb you, just softens the edges." He looked at her then, not startled, but with a kind of surprised gratitude. "You'd make a good healer." "I'm not. But I've needed one enough to learn." They stood there until the child stirred in the basket. Gideon reached for the strap and lifted it gently from the saddle horn, cradling Jameson as if the boy were his own. He didn't coo or rock, just held him against his chest, steady and sure. The sky had turned pale with low clouds. Snow would come before night. Lark watched the two of them, man and child, and felt something settle in her. Not relief, not joy even, just a deep, solid knowing. When they rode back, the trail was quieter. No birds sang. But something in the silence felt less like sorrow and more like peace. At the cabin, she took Jameson and carried him inside while Gideon unsaddled the horses. When he came in, she handed him a cup of broth. Not as thanks, not as payment. Just because it was warm and she had made it and he needed it. He took it without speaking, And in that quiet, something shifted again, not sudden, not loud, but unmistakable. They were no longer strangers, not neighbors, not even two souls caught in the same storm. They were becoming something else, something steadier, and neither of them flinched from it. By the end of November, the first real snow laid itself thick across the valley, muting the land in white and quiet. Lark had taken to lighting the lamp early, its golden glow spilling across the table where she stitched by hand, rocking Jameson's cradle with her foot. The days shortened fast, and the cold pressed deeper into the corners of the cabin. But the walls held, and the roof no longer leaked. Gideon had seen to that. He came in just past dusk, brushing snow from his shoulders, the scent of pine clinging to his coat. He set down a bundle of kindling near the hearth and glanced toward the cradle. Jameson had begun to watch everything with new alertness, his gaze following the movement of hands, the flicker of firelight. "He's tracking things now," Gideon said, kneeling beside the boy. "That's a good sign." Lark nodded, tying off the thread in her lap. "He started to grip my finger. Won't let go once he's got it." Gideon reached into the cradle, let the baby wrap a fist around the tip of his thumb. "He's got your tenacity. I don't know if that's a blessing or a burden, depends who he grows into." Lark stood and hung the stitched cloth over a peg by the stove. "I've been thinking about spring, about planting something more than potatoes this year. Like what? Beets, maybe carrots, something that keeps well. You'll need to fence in the far side, that patch is too open." "I know." She looked at him. "Would you stay through the thaw?" Gideon met her gaze, slow and steady. "I didn't have plans to leave." His answer settled in her like warm bread, filling, plain-spoken and reliable. She crossed to the shelf and pulled down a jar of preserved plums, setting it on the table. "I put these up last season. I thought we might open them tonight. It feels like a night where something sweet is allowed." They ate in shared silence, the plums tart against the bread she'd baked that morning. Jameson had drifted off again, his breath steady. The snow thickened against the windows, and the wind began to hum low around the eaves. Gideon pushed his plate aside. "I saw fresh elk tracks along the ridge this morning. Big ones. They don't usually come down that far. Maybe the snow's driving them low. Or maybe they've learned this land's quiet." Lark leaned back in her chair. "There's an old smokehouse behind the barn. My husband used to cure meat there. It's still sound. I checked it a week ago." Gideon nodded. "You thinking of hunting?" "I'm thinking I don't want to count on store flour through all of March." She folded her hands. "Would you go with me when it's time?" "I will." The fire crackled and the lamp's flame shivered in the draft. He reached across the table then, not to touch her hand, but to rest his palm flat beside hers close enough to feel the warmth, but not assuming. "I've known hard winters," he said, "but I never minded them when there was something worth staying for." Lark didn't pull away. She let the moment stretch, let it settle. "I think I'd like to know what it's like," she said. What's like?" "Not minding a winter." Gideon's voice was quiet. "Then let's find out." Outside, the wind rattled the branches, but the cabin held fast. And for the first time in a long while, Lark no longer thought of enduring the season. She thought of sharing it. In mid-December, the days thinned like old cloth, and the nights stretched long and still. Lark had taken to rising before first light even when Jameson didn't stir, her hands restless with the need to prepare. She dried the last of the wild mint and tucked it into muslin pouches for the chest, stitched a new lining for the cradle's quilt, and started a ledger of the supplies still stored in the root cellar. Gideon noticed, but he didn't speak of it. He only brought her more thread when he went to town, and once left a small tin of beeswax for her needles on the table without a word. That morning, she found him standing in the lean-to behind the barn, oiling the blade of a draw knife. Snow had piled in shallow drifts around his boots, untouched since the last flurry. He nodded when he saw her. "You plan to shape something?" she asked. "I thought to carve a handle for your kettle hook. The iron one's too short." "You've been burning your wrist, reaching over the hearth." She stepped closer, watching the slow sweep of his cloth over the steel. "You notice things." "I try." He didn't fill silence needlessly, and she'd come to understand the quiet between them wasn't absence, it was trust, built slow and rooted deep. "I was thinking," she said, folding her arms against the cold, "about marrying again." He didn't look up. "You came to a decision." "I haven't, not yet, but the thought doesn't frighten me anymore." Then, after a beat, "Not with you." This time he did meet her eyes. "That's something you'd want." "I'd want it to be right, not just for me. For Jameson, too." Gideon set the draw knife aside and wiped his hands clean. "I've never had a family of my own, not one that stayed." He stepped forward, boots creaking in the snow. "But I've slept easier under this roof than I have in years. You and the boy, you feel like someplace I could belong. Not just stay," he shook his head. "Belong." Lark reached out, took his hand, and for the first time laced her fingers through his. "Then let's make it true." They married quietly 3 days before the year turned. The preacher from Hamilton came by sleigh, his horse lathered and steaming, and the vows were spoken in front of the hearth, with Jameson in Lark's arms and the scent of spruce boughs looped along the rafters. There was no grand meal, only venison stew and cornbread, and afterward a jar of last summer's blackberries opened and passed between them. Gideon kissed her with a reverence that needed no audience, one hand at her back, the other steadying the cradle. The winter eased its grip slowly. The snow melted in patches come March, revealing the dark, damp earth beneath. Lark planted carrots in the newly fenced plot behind the barn, her skirts tucked and hands black with soil. Gideon built a clothesline from 2 cedar posts, and when the first true warm wind swept through, they hung the linens together, the fabric snapping like sails. Jameson grew pink-cheeked and strong. He rolled and reached and laughed a deep, surprising laugh that always caught Gideon off guard. "He sounds like you," he told Lark one afternoon when the boy chuckled at a soap bubble. "No," she said. "He sounds like joy." By June, the garden sprouted rows of green and the smokehouse held fresh strips of elk and rabbit. Lark taught Gideon how to dry yarrow and grind it fine for poultices. He showed her how to mend a harness and sharpen a blade so it never split the hide wrong. One night, after the chores were done and Jameson slept in his wooden crib near the fire, Lark pulled the rocker close and sat on Gideon's lap, her head resting against his shoulder. His arms wrapped around her without question. She traced the faint scar along his jaw, one he'd never spoken of, and said, "I want to grow old here. With me, with you." He kissed her temple. "Then let's make the years count." The valley bloomed, the wind softened. And in that small cabin stitched together with memory, labor, and quiet love, nothing was ever unfinished again. They lived on in the shelter of each other. The days not easy but full of work, of laughter, of the slow, sure peace that comes when 2 people choose, again and again, to stay.